country this week, newspapers and magazines vied to offer readers solutions to one of the most pressing problems of the holiday season: tipping. Who should you tip? How much should you tip? And when should you tip? It's a conundrum. Of course, the holiday tip is more like a gift. It's something you do once a year. It's like a bonus or a thank you to people who work hard for you all year. But the kind of everyday tipping that goes on in bars and restaurants in those places across America, that's actually a big business. More than $40 billion worth of business every year. And that just might be a terrible thing. Joining me now from Ithaca, New York, is a man who has spent the last 30 years of his life studying exactly why and how we tip. Dr. Michael Lin, professor of consumer behavior at the Cornell University School of Hotel Administration. So, Michael, thank you for joining us. And I really do want to sort of have you explain to us right off the bat, kind of what are the biggest factors in how we tip and why we tip, and how big we tip and why.
Okay. First off, thank you for inviting me. The biggest factor, the biggest predictor of tipping in restaurant settings is bill size. And it explains 70% of the variance or differences in tips left by different dining parties. And what that means is that bill size explains twice as much as everything else combined. Why does bill size explain so much? Because of the social norm that says you're supposed to tip 15 to 20% of the bill. So the single, by far, overwhelming factor underlying people's tipping are social expectations and a desire to live up to those expectations.
And I mean, so Michael, given the fact that it is a social norm, that essentially the server is expecting a 15 to 20% tip, is there actually any kind of real correlation between the size of the tip, how much you tip, and the quality of the service you receive?
Yes, there is a correlation. It's statistically reliable, but it's very small. Other studies have found, for example, that how sunny it is outside has as big an impact on tips as the customer's own ratings of service quality.
And I have to get into a little bit the topic of race, because I know that there is this anxiety within a lot of African Americans that A, you're going to be perceived as a small tipper, or B, if you are the person providing the service, that maybe you might not get as big a tip. And actually there are statistics that bear that out, that African Americans are tipped less, whether they're a cab driver or a server, than non-African Americans. Black cab drivers receive smaller tips on average than do white cab drivers. This is true regardless of the race of the tipper, meaning that both black and white tippers give white drivers larger tips than they do black drivers. Why is that?
Wow, I'm not 100% sure. Certainly, and it may be that you have different explanations for this depending upon the race of the tipper. Whites may tip other white service providers. It's not just cab drivers. White waiters give better tips than black waiters also. It could be that white customers simply feel a greater social rapport and identify with white servers better and leave a larger tip for that reason. Obviously, that doesn't explain why black customers would also tip a white server better. I'm really going well beyond the data here and speculating, but certainly one of the ideas that has occurred to me is blacks in this country on average tip less than whites. There's simply a lower standard of tipping in the black community than in the white community. And I wonder if when black customers are waited upon by black servers, they believe that that's an okay to use a black standard of tipping, that simply the community is more accepting of lower tips, and so they think it's more acceptable, okay, to leave a smaller tip if they have a black server, whereas when they have a white server, they know this white server is going to expect a whole lot more.
Wow.
Again, that's speculation.
It's speculation. Okay, well, we actually have a couple of African American people at the table, and we're going to talk to everybody on the panel. But I mean, Anthea, this is something that produces a lot of anxiety for a lot of people. I mean, I know that I do tip very well, right? And I tip in part because you have this perception that the person, particularly, let's say in a restaurant or the person in the salon, that this is part of their income, that it's my obligation to do it. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a little bit, too, of saying, I'm not just tipping for me, I'm tipping for the next black person that comes in, so that they won't have that expectation indication that, oh, okay, here comes a bad tipper.
Absolutely, and I want to just say to the guy at Cornell, it's like I think there's a lot of unconscious bias that happens in all of this. I mean, unconscious biases can happen for both African Americans and whites alike. So when you see somebody who looks like you're in front of you, maybe I don't have to give them so much or whatever. I personally tip a lot because I've had friends and relatives work in the hospitality industry, and when you make $2 an hour and the rest of that you've got to put up with your tips and everything, you realize how hard it is for people, and you start to tip out a lot more. Plus, you don't want people to do things to your food. Okay, let's be real. This is why I tip. I don't want you to my food. I tip my bartenders really well. I want to make sure I get the right drink. But I do think there's a sense in which, you know, when you see this unconscious bias, when you see a black person in front of you sit down at the table and you think automatically my tip is going to be less, so I'm just going to, you know, jack this up and I'm really not going to care. That's the thing we have to work against, these unconscious biases that drive the industry.
This is not just a black thing. This is a Latino thing too, right? So the assumption is that I will tip less. Really, it really is. So the doorman in my building, for example, we come from the same tribe, Dominican and Puerto Ricans, right? Of all colors, by the way. And I know that they're expecting a small tip. Well, you better believe I grease people's palms all the time because there is some social utility to the sense that I want to break a stereotype, which I've done all my life to break stereotypes. So this is one of those stereotypes. Plus, I put myself through school waiting tables. I know how hard that work is and how much people need that money. And if you work for it, of course you're going to get a big tip. But trust me, I too know. I'm sitting there, who am I going to tip and how much? I want to make sure that they realize that I will tip them well. So I'm much more likely to tip them well because I want them to think better of my people.
Yeah, and I, you know, I've done banquet service as well, so I think understanding where people are coming from helps. But I mean, Lisa, there is this other component of tipping where that it is prevalent in industries where people are paid very little, their actual wages, particularly in the restaurant industry. So in a sense, has tipping become a crutch for the restaurant industry or for businesses to be able to get away with lower wages?
Well, sort of. I mean, you know, there's a bifurcation with respect to the minimum wage. So it's $2.16 for the federal minimum wage where there is tipping. So this is, I agree with Anthea. When I look at these people I'm tipping, I'm thinking $2.16, and they've got to make up the rest. And they haven't recovered yet from the financial crisis and economic crisis. People still are not flocking to restaurants, except in Washington, where they never stopped going, it seems. But you're making up for that. So you're doing both the racial investment for the next person, as you were saying, but you're also, in my view, you're making up for lost time.
For lost wages.
And in real terms, that really hasn't grown. So we talk about 1010 not having been raised, or the 725 not having been raised, but there's been real deterioration for the people.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I could talk about this all day because I am obsessed with it. All right, well, thank you very much, Michael Lynn of Ithaca. Coming from Ithaca, Common Wong Ulrich, Anthea Butler, Ovik Roy, and Lisa Cook. Thank you all. And up next,